This whole thing started when I was around 8 or 9 years old. My family had just moved into this old house on Maple Street, the kind with creaky floors and windows that never quite shut all the way. The previous owners had left behind a bunch of random stuff in the basement, and my mom spent weeks sorting through it all, deciding what to keep and what to throw away. That's when she found the music box. It was this delicate little thing, made of dark wood with intricate carvings around the edges. When you opened the lid, a tiny ballerina would spin around to this haunting melody I'd never heard before. My mom thought it was beautiful and decided to put it on my bedroom dresser. I didn't really care one way or the other at the time, it was just another decoration to me. But then the dreams started. They always began the same way. I'd be lying in bed, staring at the music box across the room. Even in the darkness, I could make out its silhouette perfectly. Then, without anyone touching it, the lid would slowly creak open. The ballerina would start spinning, and that melody would fill my room. But here's the thing that always made my stomach drop. The music was playing backwards. I'd try to get up, try to close the box, but I couldn't move. Not sleep paralysis exactly, more like my body just refused to listen to what my brain was telling it to do. All I could do was lie there and watch that ballerina spin in reverse, while the backwards melody got louder and louder. The first few times I had this dream, I'd wake up in a cold sweat and immediately check the music box. It was always closed, always silent. I convinced myself it was just my imagination running wild because of the new house and everything. Kids have weird dreams all the time, right? But then things started changing in the dreams. After maybe the 6th or 7th time, I began noticing that I wasn't alone in my room. There was someone standing in the corner, just barely visible in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details about them, not their face, not their clothes, nothing. Just a dark silhouette that stood perfectly still while the backwards music played. The figure never moved, never spoke, it just watched. And somehow, that was worse than if it had done something scary. There was something so wrong about the way it stood there, like it was waiting for something. I finally told my parents about the dreams after they'd been going on for about 3 months. My dad just laughed and said I'd been watching too many scary movies. My mom was more understanding, but she suggested we move the music box to another room if it was bothering me. For some reason I said no. I can't explain why, but something about moving it felt wrong, like it belonged in my room. The dreams continued, maybe once every couple of weeks. Always the same backwards music, always the same figure in the corner. I got used to them, weirdly enough. They became just another part of my life, like having a weird, recurring dream was normal. Then one night, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of music. Not in a dream this time, actual music coming from my dresser. That haunting melody, playing forwards for once, drifted through my dark room. The music box was open, the ballerina spinning slowly in the moonlight, coming through my window. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't touched the box, nobody had been in my room, but there it was, playing its song like someone had just wound it up. As I stared at it, trying to figure out what was happening, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Slow, deliberate footsteps that stopped right outside my door. The doorknob turned. But here's the thing, I could see my parents' room from where I was sitting, and their door was closed. They were both asleep. So who was trying to get into my room? The door opened just a crack, and I saw part of a face peek through. It was pale, almost gray-looking, with dark eyes that seemed to reflect what little light was in the room. The person, if you could call it that, was smiling, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was the kind of smile that made you want to hide under your covers and never come out. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but I couldn't make a sound. The music box kept playing its melody while this thing stared at me through the crack in my door. We looked at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then the door closed. The music box snapped shut with a loud click, and everything went silent. I finally found my voice and screamed for my parents. They came running, turning on lights, asking what was wrong. When I told them what happened, they checked the whole house. All the doors were locked, all the windows secure. They found nothing. My dad examined the music box the next morning. He said the spring mechanism was old and probably just unwound itself during the night. As for the door opening, he figured I'd just had a really vivid nightmare that felt real. That made sense, I guess. Old houses make weird noises and kids have overactive imaginations, but I knew what I'd seen. The dreams stopped after that night. Completely. I'd lie in bed waiting for them to start up again, but they never did. The music box sat silently on my dresser, never playing on its own again. Everything went back to normal. A few years later, when I was in middle school, my mom decided to have a yard sale. She was going through old stuff again, and she asked if I wanted to keep the music box or sell it. I didn't really have any attachment to it anymore. The dreams were a distant memory by then, so I told her to go ahead and sell it. A woman bought it on the first day of the sale. She was probably in her 50s, well-dressed, seemed normal enough. She picked up the music box, opened it to listen to the melody, and smiled. She paid the $5 my mom was asking and walked away with it. I didn't think about that music box again for years. Not until I was in college and came across something online that made my stomach drop. I was reading a local news website from my hometown when I saw an article about a missing child. A 7-year-old girl had disappeared from her bedroom in the middle of the night. The police had no leads, no signs of forced entry, nothing. But what caught my attention was a quote from the girl's mother. She said her daughter had been having nightmares for months before she disappeared. Dreams about her music box playing by itself, about someone standing in her room. The mother had bought the music box at a yard sale a few years earlier. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Lots of kids have music boxes, lots of kids have nightmares. But deep down, I knew it was the same one. That carved wooden box with the backwards spinning ballerina. I've looked up that news story a dozen times since then. The little girl was never found. The case went cold within a year, and somewhere out there, that music box is sitting on another child's dresser, waiting for night to fall. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night, if I hadn't seen that face in my doorway. Would I have disappeared too? Was that thing in the corner of my room just waiting for the right moment? I'll never know for sure, but I do know one thing. I'll never buy my kids a music box. Ever. Some toys are better left at the yard sale. I'll try to keep this short, but there's a lot to unpack. Last month I was house sitting for my aunt while she went on vacation to Europe. It's this big old house on the outskirts of town that's been in our family for decades. The kind of place with too many rooms and weird angles everywhere. I'd stayed there before when I was younger, so I knew my way around pretty well. The thing about this house is that there's this basement door in the kitchen that's always been locked. I mean always, like for as long as I can remember. When I was a kid, I asked my aunt about it once and she just said it was storage and that the stairs were too old and dangerous to use. Fair enough. I never really thought about it much after that, so I'm house sitting, and everything's going fine for the first few days. I'm working from home during the day, watching Netflix at night, just enjoying having the whole place to myself. But on the 4th night, something weird happened. I was in the kitchen making a late dinner when I heard this sound. It was like someone walking around downstairs. Not footsteps exactly, more like shuffling or dragging something across the floor. At first I thought it might just be the house settling or maybe a pipe making noise, but it kept going for like 10 minutes. I stood there listening, trying to figure out what it could be. The sound was definitely coming from below the kitchen, which would be the basement, but that didn't make sense because the basement was supposed to be locked up and unused. After a while, the noise stopped. I finished making my food and tried to forget about it, but I kept glancing at that basement door. It looked the same as always. Old white paint that was peeling in some spots, with this ancient-looking brass doorknob that had probably been there since the 1960s. The next night it happened again. Same shuffling sound, same general area. This time I actually walked over to the basement door and pressed my ear against it. I could definitely hear something moving around down there. It sounded like someone was rearranging furniture or maybe boxes. I tried the doorknob, even though I knew it would be locked. It was. I shook it a few times, but the door was solid. Whatever was happening down there, I couldn't get to it from this entrance. That's when I remembered there might be another way in. The house has an outdoor entrance to the basement, one of those angled cellar doors you see on old houses. I'd never paid attention to it before, but I figured it was worth checking out. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. The cellar door was around the back of the house, partially hidden by some overgrown bushes. When I got close to it, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The padlock that should have been securing it was lying on the ground, cut clean through. The door was slightly open. I stood there staring at it for a good 5 minutes, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct I had was telling me to go back inside and call my aunt, or maybe even the police. But another part of me was curious. I mean, if someone was breaking into the basement, shouldn't I find out who and why? I opened the cellar door wider and shined my flashlight down the stairs. They were concrete and looked sturdy enough, despite what my aunt had said about them being dangerous. I could see the bottom of the staircase and what looked like a typical unfinished basement, concrete floor, exposed beams, that kind of thing. I went down. The basement was bigger than I expected. There were a few pieces of old furniture covered with sheets, some cardboard boxes stacked against the walls, and an old water heater in the corner. Nothing looked disturbed or out of place. No signs that anyone had been down there recently. But then I noticed something odd. There was a clear path through the dust on the floor, like someone had been walking the same route over and over again. The path led from the bottom of the stairs to the far wall, where I could see the other staircase that led up to the kitchen door. I followed the path and found something that made my blood run cold. At the base of the stairs leading to the kitchen, there was a small pile of what looked like food crumbs. Fresh crumbs. And next to them, a plastic water bottle that was still half full. Someone had been coming down here regularly, recently. I was about to head back upstairs when I heard the kitchen door creak open above me, footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming down toward me. I panicked. There was nowhere to hide in the basement. It was too open, too empty. I turned off my flashlight and crouched behind one of the covered pieces of furniture, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. In the darkness, I could barely make out a figure moving around the basement. They had their own flashlight, and I watched the beam dance across the walls as they moved. The beam stopped on the pile of crumbs where I'd been standing just moments before. I held my breath, trying not to make any noise. The figure stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then they started moving again, but not back up the stairs. They were walking toward my hiding spot. The flashlight beam got closer and closer. I could hear the footsteps right next to me now. I closed my eyes and waited for them to find me, but then the footsteps moved away. I opened my eyes and saw the light moving toward the cellar door stairs. I waited until I heard the footsteps reach the top before I moved. I crept over to where the figure had been standing and looked around. On the floor, exactly where they'd been, was a fresh apple core and an empty sandwich wrapper. This person wasn't just breaking into the basement, they were living here. I got out of there as fast as I could, running up the cellar door stairs and back into the house. I locked every door and window I could find and called the police immediately.
When they arrived, they searched the entire house and basement but found nothing. No signs of forced entry from inside. No evidence that anyone had been living in the basement. The officer said it was possible that a transient had been using the space temporarily and had moved on. But here's what really bothered me. When the police checked the kitchen door to the basement, it was still locked from the inside. The keyhole showed no signs of tampering, and my aunt had the only key with her in Europe. So how had someone been getting from the basement into the kitchen to leave those crumbs? And more importantly, if that door was locked from the inside, how had they gotten out? I called my aunt the next day and told her what happened. She listened to everything, then went quiet for a long time. Finally, she said something that made my skin crawl. "I should have told you about him." "Told me about who?"
My brother lived in that basement for 3 years back in the 70s. After he came back from Vietnam, he couldn't handle being around people. He'd only come upstairs late at night to get food. We had to install that lock because he wouldn't stop wandering through the house. What happened to him? Another long pause. He died down there. Heart attack. We found him at the bottom of those stairs a week later. I moved out the next day. I don't care if that makes me a coward. My aunt never mentioned anything about needing to unlock that door when she got back from her trip, but she did mention that the cellar door padlock was found unlocked again, and there were fresh crumbs on the basement stairs. Sometimes houses keep their secrets, even after everyone thinks those secrets are buried. This happened about 3 months ago when I was staying at my older brother Jake's apartment while he was out of town for work. He lives in this converted warehouse downtown, one of those trendy loft spaces with exposed brick walls and way too much open space for one person. I was between apartments at the time, so crashing there for a week seemed perfect. Jake's place has this long hallway that connects the living area to the bedroom. It's probably 15 feet long with white walls and hardwood floors that creak when you walk on them. About halfway down the hall, there's this massive antique mirror hanging on the left wall. The thing is probably 6 feet tall and has this ornate gold frame that looks like it came from some old mansion. Jake told me he found it at an estate sale and couldn't resist buying it, even though it barely fit in his car. The first couple nights there were totally normal. I slept on his couch, watched his Netflix, raided his fridge, standard house-sitting stuff. But on the third night, something weird started happening. I have this habit of getting up around 2 or 3 in the morning to use the bathroom. I'm a light sleeper, and once I'm awake, I'm usually awake for good. So that night, I got up from the couch and started walking down the hallway toward the bathroom at the far end. As I passed the mirror, I caught a glimpse of my reflection out of the corner of my eye. Nothing unusual about that, except my reflection wasn't moving at the same time I was. I stopped dead in my tracks and looked directly at the mirror. My reflection was there, looking back at me, but it was like watching a delayed video feed. Every movement I made, my reflection would copy about a half-second later, raise my hand, and a beat later, my reflection would raise its hand, turn my head, and my reflection would turn its head a moment after. I stood there for probably 5 minutes, moving different parts of my body and watching my reflection lag behind each time. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. I even tried moving really fast to see if I could confuse it somehow, but the delay was consistent every time. Eventually, I convinced myself I was just tired and seeing things. Old mirrors can play tricks on your eyes, especially in dim hallway lighting. I went to the bathroom, came back, and went to sleep without looking at the mirror again. The next morning, I tested it in full daylight. The mirror worked perfectly normal. No delay, no weird reflections, nothing out of the ordinary. I felt pretty stupid for freaking out over what was obviously just my imagination running wild in the middle of the night. But that night, it happened again. This time, I was more awake and definitely more alert. I walked down the hall specifically to test the mirror, and sure enough, there was that same half-second delay. But this time, I noticed something else that made my skin crawl. When I smiled, my reflection didn't smile back. When I frowned, my reflection stayed neutral. It was copying my movements, but not my facial expressions. I tried different expressions, raised eyebrows, sticking out my tongue, even making weird faces. My reflection would mimic the movement of my head and the general gesture, but the facial expression was always just this blank, neutral stare. After a few minutes of this, I got really uncomfortable and headed back to the couch. As I was walking away, I looked over my shoulder one more time. My reflection was still there in the mirror, but it wasn't walking away. It was standing in the hallway, arms at its sides, just watching me go. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I called Jake to ask about the mirror. I tried to sound casual about it, just mentioning that it was a cool piece and asking where exactly he'd gotten it. He told me it came from an estate sale in an old Victorian house across town. The owner had died and her family was selling everything. "Did the previous owner mention anything weird about it?" I asked. Jake laughed. "Weird how? It's just a mirror, dude. Why is it giving you the creeps?" I almost told him about what I'd been seeing, but something stopped me. Instead, I just said it was such a statement piece that it made the hallway feel different. That night, I decided to avoid the hallway altogether. I used a water bottle instead of going to the bathroom and made sure to stay in the living room area. But around 3 a.m., I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps going back and forth, back and forth. I muted the TV and listened carefully. The footsteps would start from one end of the hall, walk to the other end, pause for a few seconds, then walk back. This went on for at least 10 minutes. The thing is, those footsteps sounded exactly like mine. Same weight, same rhythm, same slight squeak on the third floorboard from the bathroom door. I grabbed a baseball bat from Jake's closet and crept toward the hallway. As I got closer, the footsteps stopped. I peered around the corner and saw nothing. The hallway was empty, but somehow it felt like someone had just been there. I looked at the mirror from the doorway. In the reflection, I could see the entire hallway behind me, including myself holding the bat. Everything looked normal, but then I noticed something that made me drop the bat. In the mirror, there were wet footprints on the floor. Dark, wet footprints leading from one end of the hall to the other, like someone had been walking back and forth with wet feet. I spun around to look at the actual hallway floor. It was completely dry. I spent the rest of the night in my car in the parking lot outside the building. When Jake got back the next day, I was already packed and ready to leave. I told him I'd found another place to stay and thanked him for letting me crash there. He asked if everything was okay, and I just said the long commute to work was getting to me. I couldn't bring myself to tell him about the mirror. What would I even say? That his antique mirror was somehow showing a different version of reality? That my reflection had started living its own life? A few weeks later, Jake called me. He said he was thinking about getting rid of the mirror because it was giving him weird vibes. Apparently, he'd started noticing things too. Movements in his peripheral vision, the feeling that someone was watching him when he walked down the hall. The weirdest thing, he said, is sometimes I'll walk past it and see myself in the reflection, but I'll be doing something I'm not actually doing. Like yesterday, I saw myself in the mirror waving, but my hands were in my pockets. I told him he should definitely get rid of it. He said he already had a buyer lined up, some collector who specialized in antique mirrors and was paying way more than Jake had originally paid for it. I wanted to ask who the buyer was, wanted to warn them somehow, but I didn't know what I could possibly say. "Hey, your new mirror might show you an alternate version of yourself?" Good luck with that. Jake sold the mirror a week later. He says his apartment feels normal again, and he's sleeping better. Sometimes I wonder about whoever bought it, whether they're experiencing the same things we did. But mostly, I try not to think about it, because every now and then, when I'm walking past mirrors in my own place, I catch myself checking to make sure my reflection is doing exactly what I'm doing. So far, it always is, but that half second of doubt never goes away. I need to tell you about something that happened right next door to me 3 months ago. I'm still losing sleep over it, and honestly, I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe in my own home again. My neighbor Sarah was the kind of person everyone loved. She worked as a kindergarten teacher, always had fresh cookies baking, and never forgot to water my plants when I went out of town. We'd been neighbors for 6 years, and in all that time, nothing even remotely strange had ever happened on our quiet little street. That all changed on a Tuesday night in February. I was watching Netflix around 10 p.m. when I heard Sarah's dog barking like crazy. Rex was this massive German shepherd who was usually the calmest dog you'd ever meet. But that night, he was going absolutely wild. Not just barking, but howling like something was terrifying him. At first, I figured maybe there was a raccoon in her yard or something. But the barking went on for almost an hour. Then suddenly, it stopped. Complete silence. The next morning, I noticed Sarah's car was still in the driveway, but her front door was wide open. I called out to her, thinking maybe she was getting something from her car, but no response. That's when I saw Rex pacing back and forth in the backyard. whimpering.
I knocked on her door and called her name. Nothing. So I called the police. When the officers arrived, they did a wellness check. They found Sarah's house completely normal. No signs of a break-in, no struggle, nothing out of place. Her coffee was still warm on the kitchen counter. Her phone was charging on the nightstand. Her purse and keys were exactly where they should be. But Sarah was gone. The weird part? And I mean really weird. The officers found something in her bedroom that made no sense. On her perfectly made bed, there were these strange symbols drawn in what looked like ash or charcoal. Not random scratches, but deliberate symbols arranged in a perfect circle. Here's what really gets me. The symbols were drawn on top of the covers, but the bed showed no signs that anyone had been lying on it. No indentations, no wrinkled sheets underneath. It was like someone had made the bed, then carefully drawn these symbols on top without disturbing anything below. The police took photos, but when they tried to research the symbols, they couldn't find any matches in their databases. They brought in experts on cults, ancient languages, even graffiti specialists. Nobody could identify what those symbols meant or where they came from. The investigation went on for weeks. They interviewed everyone on the street, checked traffic cameras, reviewed Sarah's phone records and social media. She hadn't been acting strange, hadn't mentioned any problems, hadn't been in contact with anyone unusual. Her family said she seemed completely normal when they talked to her the day before. But here's where it gets really disturbing. About a week after Sarah disappeared, other neighbors started reporting strange things. The Johnsons next door said they kept hearing footsteps in their attic at exactly 3:17 a.m. The family across the street found their garden gate open every morning, even though they locked it every night. Mrs. Patterson, who lives 2 houses down, told me she saw someone standing in Sarah's backyard at midnight. She said whoever it was seemed to be just standing there, perfectly still, facing the house. When she blinked and looked again, they were gone. I started having my own experiences too. I'd hear knocking on my walls, not from next door, but from inside my own walls. It would start around 2 a.m. and last exactly 17 minutes. I counted. Every single time, 17 minutes of methodical knocking that seemed to move through the walls of my house. The police checked my house multiple times. They found nothing that could explain the sounds. No pipes, no settling foundation, no animals, nothing. Then, exactly 1 month after Sarah disappeared, something happened that still gives me chills. I was lying in bed when I heard Rex barking again, but that was impossible. Rex had been taken to Sarah's sister's house weeks ago. I looked out my window, and there was Rex in Sarah's backyard, barking at the exact same spot where Mrs. Patterson had seen the figure. But when I blinked, Rex was gone. I called Sarah's sister immediately. Rex was sound asleep in her living room, 2 hours away. The police have officially classified Sarah's case as a missing person with suspicious circumstances. They've never found a single trace of her outside of those symbols on her bed. No DNA, no fingerprints, no evidence that anyone else had been in that house. But the strangest part of all? Last week, I got a phone call at 3:17 a.m. The caller ID showed Sarah's home number. I answered, but there was just silence on the other end. Not dead silence. I could hear something like wind, or maybe breathing. After exactly 17 seconds, the line went dead. I called the phone company the next morning. They said that was impossible. Sarah's phone service had been disconnected over a month ago. The house next door is still empty. Sarah's family put it up for sale, but it's been on the market for 2 months with no serious offers. The real estate agent told me people come to look at it, but they never stay longer than 5 minutes. I keep thinking about those symbols on her bed, about the 17-minute knocking, about Rex appearing in the yard when he was 2 hours away, about that phone call. The police say they're still investigating, but I can tell they're as lost as the rest of us. How do you investigate something that doesn't make any logical sense? I've thought about moving, but honestly, what if this isn't about the house? What if whatever happened to Sarah is somehow connected to all of us who live on this street? Sometimes I wake up at 3:17 a.m. and just lie there listening, waiting for the knocking to start again, waiting for my phone to ring, waiting for Rex to appear in Sarah's yard.
Sarah has been gone for 3 months now. 3 months of no answers, no clues, no explanation for what happened in that house. The police still can't explain it. Her family can't explain it. None of us can. I just know that whatever took Sarah from her bed that Tuesday night, whatever drew those symbols, whatever is making these impossible things happen, it's still here, still watching, still waiting. And sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I swear I can feel it watching me too. I've always been someone who believes in logical explanations. When weird things happen, there's usually a simple reason behind it. That's what I kept telling myself for months, even when I started experiencing something that terrified me every single night. It began about 6 months ago. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, completely unable to move. My whole body felt like it was pinned down by invisible weights. I couldn't speak, couldn't turn my head, couldn't even wiggle my fingers. The only thing I could do was move my eyes. If you've never experienced sleep paralysis, it's absolutely terrifying. Your brain is awake, but your body is still stuck in sleep mode. It's a medical condition that affects millions of people, so when it started happening to me, I figured that's all it was. But during these episodes, I wasn't alone in my room. Every single time, there was something standing at the foot of my bed. Not someone, something. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, completely black like a shadow, but somehow darker than the darkness around it. It didn't have features that I could make out, but I could feel it watching me. The worst part was the waiting. It would just stand there for what felt like hours, completely still. Sometimes it would tilt its head slightly, like it was studying me. Then, just before the paralysis would break and I could move again, it would start walking toward me, slow, deliberate steps. I never saw what happened next because the moment I could move, I'd scramble to turn on the lights. The thing would be gone, and I'd be alone in my room, shaking and covered in sweat. This happened maybe 3 or 4 times a week for months. During the day, I'd convince myself it was just sleep paralysis hallucinations. That's a real thing. People see all kinds of scary stuff during episodes. Shadow people, demons, intruders. My brain was just playing tricks on me, but the experiences felt so real, so vivid, and they were always exactly the same figure, standing in the same spot, moving the same way. My girlfriend Emma kept telling me to see a doctor. She was getting worried because I was barely sleeping, afraid to go to bed. But I was stubborn. I kept insisting it was just stress, just my imagination running wild. Everything changed 3 weeks ago. Emma had been staying at my place more often because she was worried about me. One morning after a particularly bad episode, she suggested we set up her dad's old security camera in my bedroom. Just to put my mind at ease, she said, to prove that nothing was actually there. I agreed, mostly to prove to both of us that I was right, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. We set up the camera on my dresser, angled it toward the bed, and connected it to an app on my phone so I could review the footage. That first night with the camera, nothing happened. I slept through the entire night for the first time in months. I felt vindicated. See, I told Emma, it was all in my head. But the next night, it happened again. I woke up paralyzed, and there it was, the shadow figure at the foot of my bed. Same as always. It stood there, tilted its head, then started walking toward me. I broke out of the paralysis, turned on the lights, and it was gone. But this time, I had footage. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and opened the camera app. My heart was pounding as I scrolled to the recording from that night. I fast-forwarded to around the time I remembered waking up. At first, everything looked normal. There I was, lying in bed, seemingly asleep. Then, at exactly 3:23 a.m., I saw myself suddenly go rigid. My eyes opened, but I wasn't moving at all. Classic sleep paralysis. But that's not what made my blood run cold. At the foot of my bed, clear as day, was the shadow figure. I watched in complete horror as this impossible thing stood exactly where I'd seen it during my paralysis. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't my imagination. It was real, and the camera had captured every second of it. The figure stood perfectly still for almost 5 minutes. Then, just like in my experience, it tilted its head slightly and began walking toward the bed, toward me. But here's what I hadn't been able to see during my paralysis. The thing didn't stop at the side of my bed. It kept walking. It walked right up to where I was lying, and then it leaned down, bringing what would be its face inches from mine. For several seconds, it just stayed there, hovering over me. Then, on the footage, I saw myself suddenly jolt awake. That was when the paralysis broke. The moment I started moving, the figure straightened up and simply vanished. Not like it walked away or dissolved. It just wasn't there anymore, like someone had flipped a switch. I must have watched that footage 50 times that morning, each time hoping I'd see something different, some explanation. Maybe it was a weird camera glitch, or shadows from outside, or anything other than what it clearly was. But there was no denying it. Something had been in my room, something that defied every logical explanation I could think of. I showed the footage to Emma. She went pale and didn't speak for almost 10 minutes after watching it. When she finally did, all she said was, "We need to get you out of that apartment." But moving didn't fix anything. The first night in our new place, the same thing happened. Sleep paralysis, shadow figure, everything exactly the same. We set up the camera again, and sure enough, there it was on the footage. The thing followed me. That's when we decided to do some research. We found out some disturbing things about sleep paralysis and shadow people. There are cultures around the world that believe sleep paralysis isn't just a medical condition. They think something actually visits you during these episodes. We found stories from people who had similar experiences. Shadow figures that appeared during paralysis, figures that showed up on cameras and security footage. People who moved to different houses, different cities, but the experiences followed them. According to some theories, these entities are attracted to people during sleep paralysis because that's when we're most vulnerable. Our minds are awake, but our bodies can't defend us. We're trapped, helpless, and they feed off that fear. I don't know if any of that is true. I don't know what this thing is or why it's attached itself to me. All I know is that every few nights I wake up paralyzed, and it's there, waiting, watching, getting closer each time. The worst part? Last week, I noticed something new in the footage. After the figure leans over me and I wake up, there's a moment, just a split second, where you can see it in the reflection of my bedroom mirror. But in the reflection, it's not just a shadow, it has a face. I've tried not sleeping, tried staying up all night, tried sleeping with all the lights on. Nothing works. When exhaustion finally takes over and I fall asleep, it's there waiting for me. Emma wants me to see specialists, maybe a priest, anyone who might be able to help. Part of me wants to try everything, but another part of me is terrified that if I dig too deep, if I try to confront this thing directly, it might stop being content with just watching. For now, I just take the footage as proof. Proof that I'm not losing my mind. Proof that something impossible is happening to me every night. Proof that some things can't be explained by medicine or science. And proof that I'm never really alone in that room, no matter how dark it gets. I work as a dispatcher for the city's emergency services. Been doing this job for 12 years, and I thought I'd heard everything. Domestic violence calls, overdoses, car accidents, murders, you name it, it's come through my headset. Nothing really shocked me anymore. At least, that's what I thought until last October. It was a Tuesday night, around 2:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I kept staring at the clock, wishing my shift would end. That's when the call came in. The voice on the other end was a woman, maybe in her 50s, speaking in this eerily calm tone. She said, "I need to report something strange happening in my neighborhood." Strange. Not dangerous, not frightening. Strange. I asked her what was going on, and she said, "All my neighbors are standing in their yards. They've been standing there for 3 hours. They're not moving." Now, this sounded bizarre, but I've had weirder calls. Maybe it was some kind of neighborhood dispute or a block party gone wrong. I asked her for more details. That's when her voice changed slightly. Still calm, but there was something underneath it now. Fear, maybe. She said, "Officer, they're all facing the same direction, toward my house, and they haven't blinked. Not once." The hair on my arms stood up, but I kept my professional composure. I dispatched 2 units to her address and stayed on the line with her. I asked her to describe exactly what she was seeing. She lived on a quiet suburban street with about 15 houses. According to her, every single neighbor, men, women, even children, was standing in their front yards. All of them were perfectly still, faces turned toward her house. She said some of them were in their pajamas, some were fully dressed, but none of them seemed to be aware of the cold October night. I asked if she'd tried talking to any of them. She said she'd gone outside earlier and called out to her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who she'd known for 8 years. Mrs. Chen didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that she'd heard anything. She just kept staring at the woman's house. While we were talking, the first police car arrived. Officer Martinez radioed in, and I'll never forget the confusion in his voice. He said, "Dispatch, I don't know how to describe this. We've got approximately 20 individuals standing motionless in various yards. They appear to be conscious but unresponsive." I instructed Officer Martinez to try communicating with the individuals and to request backup. That's when things took a turn that still gives me nightmares. Martinez approached one of the neighbors, a man he'd known personally for years, someone whose kids played on the same little league team as his own. He called out to him by name. No response. He walked directly in front of the man, waved his hand in front of his face. Nothing. But then Martinez made physical contact. He tapped the man on the shoulder. The screaming started, not just from the man Martinez touched, but from every single person standing in those yards. All at once they started screaming. Not words, just this horrible primal sound that Martinez said was unlike anything he'd ever heard. But they didn't move. They kept standing in the exact same positions, facing the same direction, but now they were all screaming in perfect unison. The woman who'd called 911 was still on the line with me. Over the sound of the screaming, she whispered, "Oh God," they all turned their heads. They're all looking directly at Officer Martinez now. I could hear Martinez shouting into his radio, requesting immediate backup and an ambulance, but his voice was shaking in a way I'd never heard from any officer in my 12 years of doing this job. The screaming continued for exactly 7 minutes. I know because I timed it. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Complete silence. Martinez reported that all the individuals had returned to their original positions, once again facing the woman's house. It was like nothing had happened, except now Martinez was visibly shaking and backup units were arriving from all across the city. Here's where the story gets even stranger. When the additional officers arrived and began conducting wellness checks on the neighbors, they found something that defied explanation. Each person they approached had no memory of leaving their homes. Mrs. Chen insisted she'd been asleep in her bed all night. A man named Robert said he'd been watching TV in his living room. A teenage girl claimed she'd been doing homework upstairs. But they were all standing outside, some of them barefoot in 40-degree weather, having been there for hours according to multiple witnesses. The officers brought each neighbor back to their homes, and that's when they discovered something even more disturbing. Every single house on that street had the same thing. All the clocks had stopped at exactly 11:23 p.m. Not just the digital clocks, the analog clocks, watches, even the microwave clocks. Everything had stopped at 11:23, which was approximately 3.5 hours before the woman made her 911 call. The investigation that followed was unlike anything our department had ever conducted. Medical teams examined all the neighbors. They were physically fine but had no explanation for their behavior. Psychiatrists interviewed them, no signs of mental illness or substance use. Environmental teams tested the air, the water, even the soil. Nothing unusual, no gas leaks, no chemical spills, no explanation for what could have caused 20 people to simultaneously leave their homes and stand motionless in their yards for hours. But the most disturbing part of this entire incident wasn't what happened to the neighbors. It was what happened to the officers who responded that night. Within 2 weeks, Officer Martinez had submitted his resignation. 20-year veteran, decorated officer, never missed a day of work. His resignation letter was one sentence: "I can no longer perform my duties effectively." Officer Santos, who had been one of the backup units, quit 3 days later. Officer Kim lasted a week before turning in his badge. In total, 6 officers who responded to that call left the force within a month. I reached out to Martinez after he left. We'd worked together for years, had a good professional relationship. I asked him what really happened that night, what made him quit a job he'd loved for 2 decades. He told me something that I've never reported, something that wasn't in any of the official reports. He said that while all the neighbors were screaming with their heads turned toward him, he could see their eyes. And their eyes weren't looking at him, they were looking behind him. All 20 of them, screaming while staring at something standing directly behind him. But when he turned around, there was nothing there, just the empty street and the woman's house. He said he never felt more terrified in his life than in that moment, knowing that 20 people could see something behind him that he couldn't see, something that made them scream in absolute terror while their minds had no memory of being outside at all. The official report lists the incident as unexplained mass psychogenic illness, basically group hysteria. Case closed, file it away, don't think about it too hard. But those clocks never did start working properly again. Every house on that street had to replace every single timepiece. And the woman who made that original 911 call? She moved out of state 2 weeks later, sold her house to the first buyer who made an offer, took a huge loss, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. I still work as a dispatcher, but I've requested to never be assigned to that district again. Sometimes, late at night during quiet shifts, I think about that call. About 20 people standing in the cold, staring at something none of us could see. About whatever was standing behind Officer Martinez that night. And about the fact that those neighbors still have no memory of the most terrifying night of their lives. My grandmother was the most practical woman I'd ever known. She was a retired nurse, believed in science over superstition, and had zero patience for what she called nonsense and fairy tales. She raised me after my parents died when I was 8, and she taught me to be logical, rational, and skeptical of anything that couldn't be proven. So when she called me to her bedside during her final days and told me she had something important to confess, I expected maybe a family secret or some old regret she wanted to get off her chest. I never expected her to completely shatter everything I thought I knew about our family. Grandma had been fighting cancer for 2 years. She was in hospice care at home, and we all knew she didn't have much time left. She'd been drifting in and out of consciousness for days, but that Tuesday morning in March, she was suddenly completely alert and lucid. She grabbed my hand with surprising strength and said, "I need to tell you about the things that happen in our family, the things I've been protecting you from your whole life." I thought maybe the medication was making her confused. I started to tell her to rest, but she cut me off with a look that reminded me exactly who I was dealing with. Even dying, my grandmother wasn't someone you argued with. She told me to go to her bedroom closet and bring her the small wooden box from the top shelf. I'd seen that box my entire life, but had never been allowed to touch it. She always said it was just old documents and photos. When I brought it to her, she opened it with a small key she kept on a chain around her neck. Inside were things that made no sense to me at first. Old photographs, handwritten letters, newspaper clippings, and what looked like a very old journal. She pulled out a photograph first. It was black and white, probably from the 1940s, showing a woman who looked exactly like her standing next to a man I didn't recognize. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was what was behind them in the photo. It was our house. The exact same house I'd grown up in, the one we were sitting in right then. But in the photograph, the house looked brand new, and there were other buildings around it that had never existed in my lifetime. Grandma saw the confusion on my face and said, "That's your great-great-grandmother, my grandmother. This photo was taken in 1943. Then she pointed to something in the background I hadn't noticed, a road sign that clearly showed our address. I told her that was impossible. Our house was built in 1967. I'd seen the construction documents myself when we'd had some electrical work done. But she just shook her head and pulled out more photographs. Photo after photo showed our house, decades before it was supposedly built. Different people, different time periods, but always the same house. In one picture from what looked like the 1920s, I could even see the old oak tree in our backyard that had supposedly been planted by my grandfather in the 1970s. But the tree in that 1920s photo was already massive. Grandma showed me newspaper clippings next, articles dating back to 1889 about strange occurrences at an address that was unmistakably ours, reports of unexplained lights, sounds, and what one article called supernatural disturbances that caused multiple families to abandon the property. Then she opened the journal. It was filled with entries in different handwriting, generations of women from our family documenting things that had happened in and around our house. The entries went back over 150 years. As I read through some of the pages, I started to feel sick. These women were describing things I'd experienced my entire childhood, but had always explained away. Doors opening and closing on their own, footsteps in the attic when no one was up there. The feeling of being watched, cold spots that moved through rooms. But what really got to me were the entries about the basement. Every woman mentioned the basement, specifically a section behind the old furnace that I'd always avoided as a kid because it gave me the creeps.
Grandma saw me reading those entries and said, "You felt it too, didn't you? Even as a little girl. That's why you never played alone in the basement." She was right. I'd never been able to explain why, but something about that corner of the basement had always terrified me. I'd sprint past it whenever I had to go down there for laundry or storage. Then Grandma told me the part that changed everything. She said the house wasn't just old. It had been built on a spot that had been significant for much longer than anyone knew. According to the journal entries, her great-grandmother had traced the strange occurrences back to at least 1847, when it was just empty land. But here's what really blew my mind. Grandma said the women in our family weren't just witnesses to these phenomena. We were connected to them. She said we had what she called the sight, the ability to perceive things that other people couldn't see. I laughed. I told her that was ridiculous, that I'd never seen anything supernatural in my life. But even as I said it, I was remembering things. The imaginary friend I'd had as a child, who my grandmother had suddenly forbidden me from talking about when I was 10. The nightmares that always featured the same dark figure standing in my doorway. The way I somehow always knew when someone was going to call before the phone rang. Grandma pulled out one more thing from the box, a letter addressed to me, written in her own handwriting. She said she'd written it years ago, waiting for the right time to give it to me. The letter contained instructions, locations, and what she called protections that had been passed down through our family for generations. She told me that she'd spent my entire childhood trying to shield me from the reality of what our family was connected to. She'd hoped maybe it would skip my generation, that I could live a normal life without having to deal with what she called the burden. But in her final days, she'd realized she couldn't protect me anymore. The phenomena had started becoming stronger, more persistent. She said I needed to know the truth so I could protect myself and any children I might have in the future. The most disturbing part was when she told me about my parents' death. I'd always been told it was a car accident, that they'd hit black ice on a winter night,
But Grandma said that wasn't the whole truth. My father had started experiencing things after I was born. He'd wanted to investigate the basement to find out what was really happening in our house. My grandmother had begged him not to, but he was stubborn. The night before they died, he'd gone down to that corner of the basement with some kind of equipment. Grandma said my mother found him down there hours later, completely catatonic. He never spoke again, not a single word, until they were driving to the hospital the next night. That's when they had the accident. She pressed that letter into my hands and made me promise to read it after she was gone. She said there were things I needed to do, protections I needed to maintain, and most importantly, areas of the house I should never, ever investigate alone. Grandma died 3 days later. After the funeral, when I was alone in the house, I finally read her letter. It contained a map of our property, showing locations where previous family members had buried objects for protection. There were instructions for maintaining what she called barriers and warnings about specific dates when the phenomena would be strongest. But the most chilling part was the final paragraph. She wrote that the basement wasn't just a basement. There was a room behind that corner wall that had been sealed for over a century. She said the women in our family had worked for generations to keep whatever was down there contained, and she warned me that I would start to feel its influence now that she was gone, that I would feel drawn to break through that wall and see what was behind it. She was right. Ever since she died 6 months ago, I've been having dreams about the basement. In these dreams, I can hear something calling to me from behind that wall. Not words, but something that feels like my name being whispered over and over. I've started following the instructions in her letter, maintaining the protections she described. But every day, the pull toward that sealed room gets stronger. Sometimes I catch myself standing at the top of the basement stairs, not remembering how I got there. Last week, I found scratches on the wall down there, deep gouges in the wood that definitely weren't there before. They look like they were made from the inside. I'm starting to understand why my grandmother spent her whole life trying to protect me from this truth, why she raised me to be skeptical of anything supernatural. She was hoping if I didn't believe in it, maybe it couldn't touch me. But now I know the truth about our family, about our house, about what's been lurking beneath our feet for generations. And I can feel it waiting for me, just like it waited for all the women who came before me. The journal entries all end the same way, with each woman eventually going down to face whatever is behind that wall. Some came back changed, others never came back at all. I'm writing this down because I'm starting to think my time is coming. The dreams are getting stronger, and I'm losing time during the day. This morning I found mud on my feet and basement dust on my clothes, but I don't remember going downstairs at all. My grandmother's deathbed confession changed everything I believed about reality, about our family, about what's possible in this world. But knowing the truth hasn't set me free. It's just made me understand that some family legacies are too dark to escape.